lots of questions about editing and working with authors and practical tips that people can apply. But for those that are thinking that editor sounds like the perfect career choice for me, let's go back a little bit. When did you originally want to be a writer? Or when did you know that editing was what you most wanted to focus on?
I wrote a lot in elementary school and middle school and high school. I don't think that I ever said I want to be a writer. I definitely wasn't saying I wanted to be an editor at that point either. I went from wanting to be a fighter pilot to a paleontologist to a lawyer to an environmental lawyer, and then figured out if I was going to be an environmental lawyer, that meant that I'd have to work on the wrong side of things if I wanted to make any money. So if I wasn't going to make any money anyway, I might as well do something I love with books.
That's excellent.
But, I think I have a glimmer of thinking about being an editor when I was in high school, maybe because I was at a schoolmate's house and her mother was an editor for textbooks. But I really started thinking about it seriously when I was in college, and honestly, I was looking for something to do over a summer that wasn't working for local government as I had the last several years. So I started kind of searching around publishers and, were there internship opportunities, that kind of thing. And I found the description for the Random House program, and it sounded so great. There was a testimonial for somebody who had worked in a children's editorial department. And I said, I could read children's books for a living. That would be the most amazing thing on earth. And I was also, unfortunately, a year too young. So I went and worked in local government again for another summer. But then the next summer, I applied and I got into this program, and I quickly learned that being an editor does not mean you're reading children's books all day for a living. That is a glorious part of it, but it is a small part of it. Being an editor, I think, is much more about being a project manager. As a colleague recently said on Twitter this week, you're doing a little bit of everything, or at least you need to have a sense of how everything works to make sure that everybody else is on board. And I like knowing how everything works. And I think that's part of what drew me to being an editor. I like understanding all the pieces, and I like, specifically when I'm working with authors, I like the idea that I'm a coach. And for me, that means sometimes I'm there to really boost you up. And sometimes I'm there to be tough and really push you to bring out the best. I loved the idea of finding gems that were maybe not in their shining glory, and being able to see what they could be, and working with somebody to achieve the best end of them. And I think that's why I still love doing what I do.
So what does your average day look like as an editor?
Well, my average day as an editorial consultant looks a little bit different than my average day in-house. But I think my average day as an editorial consultant, I have the projects that kind of are lined up, and I try to be very organized in my order of clients that I have signed and what I need to focus on every day. But I often start with some of the small kind of administrative stuff. So emails that accumulated, if I have service queries, just kind of touching base early on, because I think communication is really important. And, I try to be prompt in getting back to people. If there's some quick emails that need to be exchanged to clarify or provide pieces especially for some of my corporate clients, I like to try to knock those out And then I may be sitting, kind of reading a project and taking notes for a few hours. I may actually be editing in a project and kind of really working in the manuscript. And I do that, for probably, there are breaks involved, but probably for, the majority of the day. And then at the end of the day, any last bits and bobs that I need to finish up. But then, I'm trying to be better about not working insane hours and kind of also having a little bit of work-life balance. But when you're in-house, I think that there's not really a typical day because you never know what's going to come your way. So when I was in-house, I would try to start with emails in the morning, thinking that you would clear them out. The emails never clear out. But you might have some scheduled meetings. You might have somebody drop in and suddenly you're talking to them for an hour about some problem. Maybe there's a crisis you need to solve. Maybe a manuscript comes back from copy editing. And so now you need to turn your attention to that so that you can get it back to the author and give them as much time as possible to go through it and make their changes. Maybe somebody calls you and pitches you a book and you get into a nice long conversation with them. I kind of always enjoyed the way that the day was always a little bit different. And that you might have like your key things that you were aiming to do, but that, it might not go that way. At the same time, it does make your time, it can be stressful. It can be really hard to kind of plan. I think you'll hear every editor and agent say that they just don't have enough hours in the day, that there's so many projects that you want to work on and you just want to put all your attention to them all at the same time and you can't. I think it's fairly typical for editors and agents to have to do some of their work on their own time at home. So I certainly was doing a lot of manuscript reading at home.
What kind of hours were you putting in at that point?
I mean, when things were really high volume, I could come home, eat dinner, and then work until 10 sometimes. That was like when it was really bad.
Was that like a 13, 14-hour day, something crazy like that?
Yeah, sometimes. I think people are trying to be better. I know that I certainly realized it was getting out of hand. And so I was trying to consciously find cutoff times. But, I think that's on every publishing professional to figure out the work-life balance that works for them. And I think that's also part of growing in your career, in figuring out, yes, the stuff has to get done, but I also need to breathe so I don't go insane, and figuring out where that line is.
And a day like that, and you were still coming home and reading right before bed for pleasure?
I think honestly, I was probably reading manuscripts instead of for pleasure at that point, because the manuscripts had to get read. But that was not the ideal, having to read manuscripts at night. And that wasn't necessarily reading manuscripts I'd acquired. That was probably more likely reading manuscripts that were on submission. But you do what you have to do to get it done.
So how does that differ now that you're calling the shots? You're the consultant. You determine. I mean, obviously, you got to make sure you're hitting your numbers and rent's going to be paid and all that good stuff. But having the ability to plan your day within reason, what sort of hours are you working now? What does your typical day look like?
I think my work day for the most part is a little bit. It's more manageable. That I don't have to worry about getting to and from work because I roll out of bed. I'm in my workplace. So, I can be a little bit more flexible when I start in the morning. I think I end up working. I have a bad tendency to work too late. So I might start a little bit later in the morning, but work until 7 when I shouldn't. Which that just means that I eat dinner kind of late, which is probably not the best move. But
are you eating while continuing to work? That's a problem I have. My wife complains about it. Come to the table, like, no, I have to read this.
But I think it's a little bit more of a balance. If I need to take a break, I think I can take a break a little easier without kind of guilt because I know that it's, I can go back to it. I tend to still do some work on the weekends, but it's usually only kind of a few hours, and that's it's a choice that I make to keep things moving. I think you just have a lot more control of your time. And, if you decide that you're going to not focus on work for the day, that's fine. You're going to have to make up the work at another point, or maybe your deadlines get pushed or you don't get that client, or, but you kind of figure out the balance that feels right for you, as long as you're feeding yourself and paying the bills.
Very crucial stuff. I find that I love to read, and if I'm drafting, I read even more because I'm so excited to have a book that's done, that I don't have to worry about it. It's not anything to do with me. I could just let somebody else do all the work. But when I'm heavily editing, at the end of the day, if I've been just staring either at a printed page or a manuscript, it's time for a video game. It's time for a movie. Let me do something that's the complete opposite. So time for a walk. Let me come back refreshed. Do you find that, or can you still read for pleasure even as you're doing so much reading for work?
I can definitely still read for pleasure. For some reason in my brain, it's just I have an ability to kind of shut it off. I rarely, when I'm reading a book, do I start kind of editorially analyzing it, which I know a lot of people do. If I'm reading for pleasure, I tend to just leave myself in the book. If I am starting to editorially analyze it, then there may be problems with the book, perhaps, but I try not to.
Time to find another book.
And then the editor that book. So I try not to judge that. But I'm kind of a news junkie. So if I'm not doing super deep editorial work, the news is probably on in the background for a lot of the day. But at night, I tend to, shut things off. I love Twitter, so I'm on Twitter a lot. And we can talk about that maybe, because I also use Twitter to help editorially as well. But I'm just kind of goofing along online, watching the news or watching Netflix or whatever. I think I use that nighttime to just kind of decompress and reset my brain, so that I can be fresh the next day.
I am also a political junkie. I'm trying so hard to recover, but I'll have the news on first thing in the morning while I'm getting my coffee and everything set up, and then I'll have it on later in the afternoon. And I keep trying to tell myself that watching anchors comment on the events isn't helpful beyond the initial fact. Just read what happened, and then the rest of your day could be free. And when I figure out how to do that, I'll let you know.
I think part of the problem with that is that there's constantly breaking news. So even though you're hearing the same things reported over and over again, there's constantly new things added. So it makes it hard to cut off. But
well, hopefully we'll eventually get a new POTUS and the news will go back to being less interesting all the time.